Well, it's one of those stories that's it's been around a while, but it's a pretty good story. About a Christian lady who had to do a lot of traveling for her business, and so she did a lot of flying. Unfortunately, flying always made her nervous, so she'd take her Bible along so that she could read, and it would help her relax. On one occasion, she was sitting next to a man who saw her pull out her Bible, and as she did, he gave a little chuckle. After a while, he turned to her. He said, "You don't really believe all that stuff in there, do you?" To which the woman replied, "Well, of course I do. It's the Bible." The man came back, "Well, what about that guy? What about that guy who was swallowed by a whale?" She said, "Oh, yeah, Jonah, yes, of course I believe it." He answered, "Well, how do you suppose that he survived all that time inside that whale?" She said, "Well, I really don't know. I guess when I get to heaven, I'll ask him." The guy's snarky response was, "Well, what if he's not in heaven?" To which the woman calmly replied, "Then I guess you'll have to ask him." Grab your Bibles. We'll head in the direction of Jonah chapter 1 this morning, towards the back of the Old Testament, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. If you get to Micah and Nahum, then you have gone too far. Jonah chapter 1 is where we'll be dropping anchor this morning. We're actually going to move right down through that text, and so it's always a good idea to have hard copy or electronic version open there on your lap. It'll make more sense. You can track along with me. This is where we'll be spending our time. We're going to begin a brand new mini-series this morning on the book of Jonah. I'm calling it Lessons from the Depths. Over the course of this year, we've been jumping around quite a bit in the Scriptures. Early on, the beginning of the year, we were talking about a number of different doctrinal issues, theological, and so we were moving around in the Scriptures. And then, actually, after that, we went into a biographical series where we were studying different characters in the Bible. So I thought it'd be good for us just to take a section and move through it together. That's really the preference. That's what I would prefer to do on a regular basis. And so we're going to be in Jonah here, and probably later this fall, we'll head into a New Testament book. I'm thinking maybe the book of Galatians. We'll see, but that's kind of the way I'm leaning right now. I don't know how much you know about this book, so let's just start with some fast facts. How about that? The last 12 books of the Old Testament are known as the minor prophets. Not because they're less important than the other prophetic works, but because their material is shorter. Tara Lee Cobble, Bible Recap, put it like this. She said, "It's not the quality of words, but the quantity that sets a minor prophet apart from a major prophet." Well, Jonah is unique in that, unlike the other prophetic books that contain the words spoken by God through his messenger, this book is mainly narrative. And if you read through it this past week, and you picked up on that, it's a story about the prophet. Jonah lived during the time of King Jeroboam II, so that would put him somewhere around 750 BC. It also tells us that Jonah was one of the earliest prophets who maybe followed shortly after Elisha in the Old Testament. Now, there are some who regard this account as an allegory. They try to tell us it's not actual history. I, for one, disagree. For a couple of reasons. Jonah is actually mentioned as a historical figure. You can see there in 2 Kings 14 that he actually spoke the word of the Lord to King Jeroboam. But even more importantly, Jesus himself treated Jonah as a historical figure. Remember what he said in Matthew chapter 12? "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." There are different ways to outline this material. For example, in Jonah chapter 1, we'll discover that the prophet is packing. In Jonah chapter 2, we'll discover Jonah praying. In Jonah chapter 3, he'll actually be preaching, and the book will actually end with Jonah pouting. So if that helps you remember, you can identify each of those chapters: packing, praying, preaching, pouting, prophet. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Or you can go with this direction. In Jonah chapter 1, Jonah is running from God. In chapter 2, he's running to God. In chapter 3, he's running with God. In chapter 4, he's actually running against God. So there's a number of ways to outline this material, but I hope that as we move through the study, there'll be a greater familiarity with it. If we were to play a game of word association, and I said, name the first thing that comes into your mind when I say the word Jonah, what would you say? Right. We've already talked about it, right? Probably the first thing you would say is whale. And yet I hope it becomes obvious as we investigate this text that the whale is not the primary focus of this account. After all, a subject that takes up only 3 verses out of a total of 48 can hardly be regarded as the author's primary concern, right? I like the way Bible expositor G. Campbell Morgan put it. He said, men have been looking so hard at the great fish that they failed to see the great God. Let's make certain that we don't make that mistake, right? The greatness of our God is the primary focus of this book. And so today we're going to focus on the greatness of God's relentless pursuit. You're following along in the outline today. You can begin to fill in some of those blanks. Get ready for some additional references. But we're going to focus on the greatness of God's relentless pursuit. And so the first lesson, remember I said lessons from the depths? So the first lesson we'll discover in this series is that God relentlessly pursues his people. Not to destroy them, but to bring them back into the joy, usefulness, and satisfaction that's found when we surrender to his will. If you're following along that outline, I'm going to 3 realities today, 3 realities that come from this text that emphasize this specific lesson. The first one is this: God pursues us even when we run from his plans. You see the text? You have it open on your lap today. The account begins very straightforward, doesn't it? Look at the first 2 verses. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. You notice that we're not told specifically how this message came to the prophet, are we? We don't know whether it was a dream. We don't know whether it was a vision. We're not sure if God spoke to him in an audible voice, but this much we can safely say: there was no cause for confusion in the prophet's mind. I mean, stop and think about it. What part of go to Nineveh don't you understand, right? And it's important to keep in mind that when these instructions came to Jonah, Nineveh was indeed, as our text indicates, a great city. Certainly one of the greatest in the world at that time. It was situated on the east bank of the Tigris River, about 400 miles from the Mediterranean. Genesis 10 informs us that it was built by Nimrod, the great-grandson of Noah. And we know from other historical records that Sennacherib made it the capital of Assyria in about 700 BC. Truly, it was marvelous in appearance. There were 5 walls with 3 moats or canals surrounding it. The walls themselves were 100 feet high and so wide that 3 to 4 chariots could drive abreast on them. There were beautiful palaces with the finest of gardens. There were 15 gates guarded by colossal lions and bulls that opened into the city. There were 79 halls decorated magnificently in alabaster and sculpture. The temple in the city was in the form of a great pyramid that glittered in the sun. Indeed, Nineveh was a thriving metropolis of that era, but Jonah had no interest in touring it. He wanted nothing to do with it. Verse 3 makes that clear, doesn't it? But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. As I mentioned earlier, here in chapter 1, Jonah is the packing prophet. He's running from God. Now, no reason is given at this point for his disobedience. We'll learn more about that later in the book. We're simply informed here that Jonah is AWOL from God's army. Now, there's some disagreement among Bible scholars as to the exact location of Tarshish, but most believe it was in modern Spain, more than 2,500 miles from Israel. 200,000 miles in the opposite direction of Nineveh. So it's almost like Jonah took out his compass and said, let's see, God wants me to go there? I think I'm going to go there. Very opposite direction. And Tarshish was like the very edge of the known world at that time. Can you see it there? Jonah is trying to put as much distance as he can between himself and the Assyrians. Look for yourself, the last part of verse 3. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went aboard and he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now keep in mind that ships in those days didn't sail on a schedule. As a result, the fact that a ship just happened to be leaving for Tarshish that day would have been viewed by Jonah as a sure sign that he was making the proper decision. Isn't it incredible how we can rationalize our actions when we're determined to disobey the Lord? Somebody said it like this: when a person decides to run from the Lord, Satan will always provide the transportation. And down through the centuries, there have been all kinds of people who have attempted to outrun God. One of the most extreme cases that I've ever heard of took place over 100 years ago. Very wealthy German woman who was totally anti-God, but she was determined that her tomb would never be opened. And so it was sealed with a slab of granite, and then blocks of stone were placed around it with heavy iron clamps, fastening the blocks to each other and to that granite slab. The inscription on her grave read like this: this burial place, secured for all eternity, must never be opened. But when you know it, a small birch tree had other plans. A little seed sprouted under the covering, and that tiny shoot found its way between two of the slabs. Slowly and surely it grew there until it broke the clamps apart, lifted that granite lid, and it now rests against the trunk of the birch. Man's power can't even secure a tomb from natural destruction. How much less can it secure the soul against that day when we must stand before the Lord and give an account of all the deeds done while in the body? The psalmist expressed it like this. He said, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." Jonah really should have known better, right? The prophet bought a ticket, but he didn't reach his destination, and he didn't get a refund. You see, gang, when God reveals his plans to us, we better obey no matter how many ships are waiting for us at Joppa. Can I ask you today, what's your Nineveh? What's your Nineveh? Are you obediently pursuing God's desires, or are you running in the opposite direction? Has God asked you to do something, or maybe reminded you of his expectations in his word, and you've resisted? Perhaps even pretended that you didn't hear him, or maybe just flat out ignored him and said, "God, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go the other direction." God's relentless pursuit begins with his gracious refusal to let us find lasting peace in disobedience. We cannot outrun the presence of the Lord. Reality number one, God pursues us even when we run from his plans. Reality number two, God pursues us through the storms that reveal our rebellion. I already called your attention to those words in verse 3, but Jonah. Now look at the opening words of verse 4, then the Lord, right? Or actually, the ESV actually translates, but the Lord. You might even want to circle those two phrases, but Jonah, but the Lord, right? You realize that phrase, but God, appears 45 times in the Scriptures? Another 60 times we encounter the phrase, but the Lord. So over 100 times in the Bible, we see this concept of but God or but the Lord. They suggest to us that everything that transpires in the story after those words is radically different because God inserted himself into the situation. You see, gang, no matter how hard we try to surprise or outsmart God, he's always one step ahead of us, isn't he? Verse 4, then the Lord, but God, sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Please notice that disobedience and rebellion will always lead us into troubled waters, right? In this case, the Lord sends a storm that was so severe that it even panicked these seasoned sailors. Check it out, verse 5. These pagans become so terrified that they actually resort to prayer. And they start calling on the name of any god they could think of to rescue them. You see, deep down, they had this uneasy feeling that this was no ordinary storm. They were convinced that it was more than likely connected to some terrible sin. One of their gods was responsible for it. But when their false deities couldn't provide the solution, they began to take the steps that were available to them. In this case, they started dumping their cargo. And where's Jonah in all this commotion? What's he up to? We'll look at it there. The last part of verse 5. Incredulously, he's sound asleep in the bottom of the boat, blissfully unaware of all the turmoil that he's created. Apparently, the shock of being called to Nineveh has taken a toll on his psyche, and he's happy to have the opportunity just to catch some Z's on a ship that he's assuming will carry him far from his distress. Of course, you already know, I'm sure, that Jonah's in for a rude awakening. You can see it there in verse 6. The captain discovers God's sleepy spokesman, and you can undoubtedly pick up on his annoyance. You see it in those words. Much like you parents, right? When you find your teenager still in bed at noon on a Saturday morning, right? How can you sleep? What are you doing? Get up, call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us and we will not perish. The irony is thick, isn't it? Here's a pagan sailor admonishing a prophet of God that it's time to pray. But then again, it also indicates to us just how far this prophet has drifted from his intimacy with God. And make sure you don't miss it here. The entire ship and crew are in peril at this point, not just Jonah. You see, gang, no man is an island to himself. We never sin in a vacuum. And when we choose to disobey God, we risk taking down our family, friends, loved ones as well. Jonah made his way to the dock only to discover that the sailors have now huddled up. And as a last resort, they decided to roll the dice to determine who the guilty culprit is. In ancient times, the casting of lots was considered authoritative and final. And when you know it, when it was Jonah's turn, it's Yahtzee, right? There it is. So now the sailors know who the culprit is. They know who the cause behind this storm. Here comes the interrogation. They asked him, tell us, who's responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? The prophet is suddenly on the hot seat. And now for the first time, he begins to realize that he's in deep weeds. You see, the person who tries to outrun God always gets more trouble than they bargained for. And it's at this point that the light begins to penetrate the prophet's darkened thinking. His reply in verse 9 represents the focal point of this entire first chapter. He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. I underscored the God of heaven there. That particular phrase identifies Jehovah as the supreme deity, the ultimate source of all power and authority, the same God who, according to Jonah, is the maker of the land and sea. Fascinating. Jonah here is a lot like many professing believers today. They can recite facts about God. Sometimes they can even quote Bible verses, and yet at the same time, they choose to ignore his commands. Stop and think about what Jonah's just said. If God is the God of heaven and also the same Lord who created and controls the land and the sea, then the obvious question is this: where are you going to go? Where are you going to go to get away from a God like that? Which is exactly the conclusion that these pagan sailors come to. Look at their response in verse 10. It's more of a slap up the side of the head than it is a question. What have you done? Right? It's a statement intended to cause the guilty party to reflect on their decision and come to their senses. Gang, I can't help but wonder if the Spirit of God doesn't occasionally come to us and ask us that same identical question. What have you done? What are you doing? Don't you realize the amount of pain that you're inflicting on yourself as well as those who love you? Isn't it interesting? Jonah says he worships and fears the Lord. But does he really? His actions certainly don't back that up. And so that also challenges us, doesn't it? Do our actions line up with what we profess? Does our daily conduct confirm or conflict with our stated convictions? God pursues us even when we run from his plans. He pursues us through storms that reveal our rebellion. And finally, reality number 3, God pursues us with mercy that restores us to his purpose. In verse 12, God's runaway prophet offers a solution to their dilemma. You can see it there. He says, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." The crew, of course, is initially unwilling to do that. They don't want to be responsible for Jonah's demise. But ultimately, they have no choice. And so, after offering a short prayer on Jonah's behalf, they do exactly that. They toss him overboard. And the results are dramatic. 2 noteworthy things transpire. You see in verse 15 that the raging storm was instantaneously switched off. Immediately grew calm. And the crew of the ship comes away from all this with a healthy respect for the true God and his power. You can see it in verse 16 as they express their relief and gratitude by offering a sacrifice and making vows to Jonah's God. Wait, what? Our God is so great that he can take his servant's rebellion and still use it to bring honor to his name. Jonah made a poor choice, but God's plan here was not hindered or thwarted in any way. You see, when God is not permitted to rule, he overrules, and he still accomplishes his purposes. The question, of course, is not how much can the Lord be glorified through our disobedience, right? But rather, how much more can God be glorified when we eagerly submit to his plan and do what he asks us to do? Well, you probably are aware, but Jehovah wasn't finished with Jonah just yet. Verse 17, "But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights." No surprise, here's where the book of Jonah is most frequently attacked. Critics trying to discredit the text will insist that a whale has a small gullet that has great difficulty swallowing an object even as large as an orange, let alone a grown man. I really don't want to go down that rabbit trail at this point. You can decide for yourself. I'll just say I settled this matter years ago when I accepted Genesis 1:1 at face value. If you can get past Genesis 1:1, then you can get past the rest of the Bible. If you have to come up for air at Genesis 1:1, then you're going to have to come up for air in a lot of the Bible. Truth be told, there are a number of similar historical incidents on record. There have been fishermen. There have even been giant squids with tentacles as thick as a man's leg and often up to 30 feet in length that have been swallowed by whales. But I will remind you again that the Lord, not the whale, is the important agent in this book. Technically, the word isn't even whale here. The Hebrew says the Lord provided a great fish. Maybe it was specifically for this particular occasion. We have no way of knowing, but we know that God prepared this great fish. You see, gang, what it comes down to is not how big was the fish's throat, but rather how great is the God that we serve. The primary issue is not, is it possible for a whale to swallow a man, but rather, is our God capable of accomplishing the miraculous? And the answer, of course, must be affirmative. In all of these events, the storm, the casting of the lots, the big fish, in all these matters, we witness the hand of God. They were all planned by him, not to frighten Jonah, but to prove to him that he did not have to fear God's plan. The Lord is teaching Jonah a very important lesson here. It's one that we need to hear. When we make the choice to reject God's will, we wind up being the loser. When we make the choice to reject God's will, we only hurt ourselves. Think about it. The prophet lost his peace. He lost his ministry. He lost the opportunity for service and fulfillment. Indeed, he almost lost his life, right? And yet, even in the midst of all this drama, he discovered that God still cared for him. Even though Jonah rebelled, God was providentially watching over him and preparing him for service. Essentially, what God is saying here is, Jonah, you don't have to be afraid of my will, and yet you had better be afraid to oppose my will. But regardless of the choice that you make, I'm going to love you and care for you no matter what. I've shared this with you before, but there's a poem written way back in 1890. A guy by the name of Francis Thompson. It's called The Hound of Heaven. And the primary theme is, just as the hound chases the rabbit and refuses to give up, ever drawing nearer with that relentless pace, so does God in his divine grace pursue the fleeing soul. We often try to escape God by seeking happiness in the things of this world. Things like pleasure and toys and careers and human relationships. But none of those things can fully satisfy us, can they? God here is compared to a hound not because he's cruel, but because he's persistent, steady, faithful, and loving. The pursuit is not punishment, it's his mercy. Are you ready for the question? Is it possible that you're here this morning with paw prints on your back? Is God in pursuit of you? Has he been trying to chase you down? Did he bring you to this service today? Bottom line this morning, you cannot outrun the God who loves you. That's the good news. You can't outrun the God who loves you. Jonah chapter 1 reveals a God who speaks clearly, pursues patiently, disciplines lovingly, and rescues mercifully. The question is not whether God can find us when we run. The question is whether we'll surrender to the one whose plan is always better than our escape route. So stop running. Identify your Nineveh. Trust that God's will isn't something to fear, but the pathway to your greatest usefulness, peace, and satisfaction. We're going to head into a time of sharing in the Lord's Supper today. Did everybody receive communion elements as you came in today? Did we overlook anybody? Raise your hand if we somehow missed you. Anybody? Right there. Okay. Otherwise, I think we're clear. Good job, Matt. Paul says in the New Testament that a man ought to examine himself before he shares in these emblems. And so before we partake, maybe ask the Lord, is there a Nineveh in my life? Is there an assignment, a task, an action that you're asking me to take, and I'm running in the opposite direction? If he's nudged you along those lines today, then I would encourage you, even before we share, to confess that to him, seek his forgiveness, and determine to make it right. It's possible you're here this morning and you've never entered into a relationship with the God of this universe. Again, I want you to recognize he loves you. He's pursuing you. It's no accident that you're at this particular service. He expected you here. And if you're ready and at a point where you say, God, I want to know you personally. I want to experience intimacy with you. You can care for that matter right now where you're seated. What if we do this? Just bow your heads with me for a minute. We'll pray together. And if you're at that point where you're ready to enter into a relationship with God, then I'd encourage you to pray this way. I'll lead you in a prayer. You just silently repeat it from your heart right now, okay? God, thanks for not giving up on me. Thanks for continuing to hunt me down. I recognize today that I've been running in the wrong direction. I confess to you that I am a sinner and I need the salvation that you alone can offer. I'm asking you to wash me, make me clean, forgive me of my sins. I believe that Jesus is everything he claimed to be. And from this point forward, I want to live my life to serve him. Thank you. Thank you for hearing my prayer. Amen. If you prayed that prayer this morning, especially if it's for the first time, I encourage you to share that news with somebody. I'd love to. You can tell me as you're exiting today. That'd be great. You'd make my day. But by all means, tell somebody, family member, friend, let them know that you made that decision today to be a Christ follower. Let us come alongside, be an encouragement to you, help you as you get grounded in your faith.